Thank you. Good evening. I'm an unannounced participant. My name is Charles Cohen. I'm professor of history and religious studies at the university and director of the Lubar Institute for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions. In that capacity, I'm also the lead faculty member for the UW-Madison's year-long response to the White House Campus Interfaith and Service and Community Challenge. The challenge, which is the brainchild of Eboo Patel, the Interfaith Youth Corps of Chicago, and also a member of the President's Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Relationships, is engaged more than 200 campuses across the country to develop various programs that encourage interfaith discussion and interfaith service activities. This event tonight is part of UW's year-long participation in that initiative. And I'd like to suggest, if you're interested in this, we have a website that's on the Lubar Institute's homepage. That's the link to it, and you can find events. If you're interested in involving yourself in, say, Twitter discussions or Facebook discussions, you can get online there as well. Now, some of you may or perhaps may not think it's kind of incongruous. Why would an event sponsored by atheists, humanists, and agnostics of UW-Madison be included in the interfaith initiative? To my mind, there's absolutely no incongruity at all. The initiative is designed to bring together people from different faith traditions, and to my mind, that includes no faith traditions at all. It's precisely those people who should not be left out. Statistics, polls have suggested at least two things about the group we'll call basically atheists, agnostics, and humanists. One is that they continue to be distrusted by perhaps as large a percentage of Americans as distrust any particular religious group. And the second thing is that the same polls often show that this group is one of the largest, or perhaps the most quickly rising number of Americans as well. We can dispute what no religion, that when people put this down, might mean, but I think the statistics suggest that the group of people who are distancing themselves, at the very least, from received traditions is growing. To my mind, as someone very interested in American religious pluralism, as I teach it in my classes, and as someone who is also very interested in having people of different backgrounds talk to each other, because it is precisely those kinds of conversations, I think, that, as I like to say, thicken American civil society and increase the conversations among individuals of different backgrounds, and one hopes provide greater understanding of different traditions among people of other traditions. That this group is precisely one that needs to be included. And so Chris Calvi, who's been very deeply involved, there's Chris, in AHA, when we put out the word last spring that this initiative was gearing up, he replied, and as he can tell you on more than one occasion, I've urged him to get this symposium or this event started. So again, I'm delighted to give you a little bit of background on the initiative and this particular event. And now I'll introduce Mike Renuta, who is president of the AHA, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Amita. I'm the president of the AHA. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is awesome that we got such a good showing. Just a plug for another event we're doing next week. We're going to be having a debate with Badger Catholic at the, which one is that? The, no, not Union South, the Union Theater. And it's going to be awesome. It's going to be a panel discussion of some of our students against some Badger Catholic students, so we're really excited about that. I'd like to thank again the White House Initiative Challenge. It's really exciting. We raised, last I heard was like $1,600 in an interfaith way to raise money for Second Harvest Food Bank. So that's a great thing. We're doing very well with that. And I'd also like to thank the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as well as the Madison Area Coalition of Reason. And without any more words, I'd like to bring up our speaker tonight. He was a preacher for almost 20 years. But now he doesn't do that anymore. Preaches for our side. He's the author of The Good Atheist, and you may have known him from his big debate with Dinesh D'Souza last year. That was a lot of fun. So welcome the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Charles. You had to remind me about Dinesh D'Souza. That was a fun debate. He's quite a character, but I don't think there was anyone in that audience that he did not offend in some way or other. Even the Catholic people who invited him, I asked him, did he think transubstantiation was real? And he said, no, that's just a metaphor. I said, well, then were Adam and Eve real? And he said, no, that's just a metaphor. And he said, those Bible-believing born-agains are ignoramuses, he said. And I said, well, if that's just a metaphor, is God a metaphor? And were you there? He said, yeah, God's a metaphor too. So what is he arguing for, actually? And then he said, there is no such thing as there are no atheists. He said, there are only wounded theists. That's what he called us, non-believers. So we did 7 debates total since then, and it's always fun to educate and to rile up. I love audiences that are hostile and riled up. It gets me going. So please don't be too polite tonight. I'm in better form when you're not. And it's true, right now, whatever it means to be non-religious, and a lot of non-religious people are indeed spiritual in some way. Non-religious people can have beliefs, they're just not religious. Whatever that means, that is the fastest growing, quote-unquote, religion in the United States right now. In 1990, the American Religious Identification Survey reported 7.5% to 8% of Americans who picked no religion, whatever that means. 11 years later, the same survey with Barry Cosman and others, that went up to 14.5%. And since that time, it's gone up to almost 16%. So whatever it means, non-religion is growing. We do know that this generation right now, young people, college age to 20-somethings, is the least religious ever. It's up to almost 30% of this demographic that is non-religious. And there's talk about the 30% under 30. You young people probably don't know how good it is right now compared to what it used to be in the past. And groups like this, like AHA, there's groups all over the country. The Secular Student Alliance has more than 300 groups right now, when a few years ago they only had 40. They're just popping up all over. In Australia, there's now a national group of free thought college campus groups, and they met last year for the first time, and a lot of them thought they were the only ones. They started this group on campus because, what are we going to do? There's all these religious groups, and what about us non-religious? And so when they got together, they found out there were 25 others, and they were all surprised to see it happen. That's kind of neat. That's showing that there's a movement that's from the bottom up. It's an organic thing. It's not like some atheist evangelist came to your campus and said, we're going to convert all of you to atheism, and you need, it wasn't that. It's just human beings naturally, organically. Whatever it was that happened in Europe, and there are a lot of explanations for it, after centuries of devout religious belief and religious fighting and wars and the 30 Years' Wars, which wasn't just, like Christians versus the Muslims, it was also Christians against each other, Catholics versus Protestants. Whatever it was that happened in Europe, where today most Europeans are thoroughly secular, most of them are just basically non-religious. They had these gorgeous empty churches over there. How did that happen? Maybe the war had something to do with that. Maybe just naturally human beings want freedom. We don't like some tyrannical group over us telling us what we must think and what we must do. I think the basic human state is that once we have freedom, we guard it, we love it, we protect it. So whatever it was that happened there seems to be happening here on this continent as well. And I say it's about time. It's nice to see that. We are improving, we are growing. We might have some religious instincts as a species, but that doesn't mean we are stuck with them. We have instincts toward sexism, we have instincts toward racism, we have instincts toward violence, but we can rise above things like that and religion as well. And I think that's what we're seeing happening. And groups like yours are to be credited and applauded for promoting. It's not like you guys get together once a week, you atheists, and get in a huddle and say, there's no God, no, there's no God, no, there's no God. I mean, it's not that you're against something, you're for things, right? Why did you start the group? Chris, you here, and Mike, what was the reasons that you did that? What?
Meet like-minded people.
Meet like-minded people, social, just to be around others. Of course, here in Madison, there's plenty of like-minded non-believers. Down in Birmingham, Alabama, their group, all three of them get together, you know. Or I was at Texas A&M a couple years ago, and it was about 6 of them. They were kind of like scared like this. But here in Madison, my goodness, our daughter Sabrina, she's at UW at Whitewater now. She doesn't realize how good she had growing up here in Madison, where most of the kids in her classes all through the school were non-believers or non-believing Jews. Or I saw Sabrina and her friend, I think it was Sarah, they were talking about another girl, Christy, and they were whispering, guess what? Christy, she goes to church. She does, but she's so nice. They were like, it's like the Christians here in the Madison schools were like the minorities, you know, and so it's pretty special. I think she's getting a little bit of a taste because Whitewater is a little tiny bit different from Madison, but in any event, it's nice to see this happening all over the country, all over the world. I get to travel. This year I was on 31 campuses with groups like this in 25 different states, talking about different things, debates and lectures and that. And I think it's exciting. We're seeing, I think maybe someday we will turn the corner. In, who knows, a half century from now, we'll look back at this generation as the beginning of that corner being turned. So that's pretty exciting. Wasn't always that way in this country. Our country's a great country. We are a proudly rebellious nation. We fought a revolutionary war. We kicked out the king, the sovereign, the monarch, the dictator, the lord, the master. We didn't want some big overlord telling us what to do. Whereas governments before that time, and some since that time, have based themselves and written constitutions based on the sovereign authority of some god or some deity or a monarch, or establishing the evangelical Lutheran Church in Scandinavia or something to be sort of the authority. We in the United States were the first country ever to take that whole thing and turn it upside down. Instead of an authority above us, we said, no, we're going to rebel. We're going to fight a revolutionary war. We're going to kick out that sovereign, and we turn it upside down like this. And what is the sovereign in our country? We the people. Yeah. It's a wonderful thing. We were the first country in history to separate religion from government formally. So we the people decide. We the people think for ourselves. We are in charge, and we are not subject to some ecclesiastical court or some church or some Vatican or some other religious authority to legitimize or authorize our government. Although a lot of people are believers, and many of the founders of our country were devout believers, none of them wanted their personal beliefs to rule our country. None of them thought the rest of us all had to become carbon copies of their private views. Even if it were true, even if all the founders were born again, speaking in tongue, evangelical Christians who loved Jesus and went to church, even if that were true, it doesn't follow that the rest of us have to become like them, and they didn't want that. They didn't think they even had the authority to inject their personal private religious views on the rest of the country. If that were true, if it were true that we were all obligated to go back to the founders and figure out what their views were and then be like them, well, then we should take the vote away from women. None of the founders thought women should vote. Well, maybe some of them thought it privately, but none of them even cared that women should participate in our democracy. So are we obligated to go back to those views and say, oh, we can't have women voting because our founders didn't want that? Many or most of the founders owned slaves. And slavery was a sticky issue. And because they tabled the whole idea of slavery, look at how horrible the Civil War ended up becoming. And so are we obligated to go back and, just like Thomas Jefferson had slaves, are we all supposed to be slave owners? Of course not. Our country is a country of freedom. They wrote a constitution that is completely godless, totally secular. I sometimes talk at high school campuses and I'll ask high school students, how many times does the word God appear in the U.S. Constitution? And some of them go, 12? No, not that many. 5? 6? You know, and it's like, it's not something they pay attention to. If you listen to the religious right, you think our country was infused with Christianity and God from the very beginning, and our principles and our laws are based on the Ten Commandments. How many times does God appear in the U.S. Constitution? 0. None. During the Constitutional Convention, how many times were the Ten Commandments mentioned? You know, Madison took a lot of notes. How many times did they talk about the Ten Commandments as a basis for American law and principles? How many times? 0. It wasn't mentioned even once. It wasn't even brought up. What we have in our Constitution is, we do have reference to religion in the Constitution, but they are exclusionary references. Our founders were wise. They were smart. They had realized, based on a history of a century and a half of colonial divisiveness, our country was not founded by the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the Mayflower. Those were people who were indeed escaping religious persecution, but not because they were Christians, but because they were the wrong kind of Christians. In fact, the Puritans were fiercely anti-Catholic. That was why they came to this country. They wanted to get away from the horror of Rome. They wanted to get away from the Catholic influence on the Church of England and all of that. They came to escape. There's that joke. The Puritans loved religious freedom so much that they kept it all to themselves. And they did. They came over and they set up their own city on a hill, their own little private theocracies, and they persecuted, they expelled, you couldn't participate, you couldn't vote if you didn't have the right views, if you weren't a Trinitarian, or if you weren't this or you weren't that. They formed these little tiny colonial theocracies on this continent. And of course they didn't found the government, they didn't found the United States of America. In fact, those people who do think that our origin goes back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims are ignoring the 12,000 years of Native American, or now they're saying 15,500 years. Now scientists are thinking it's even more earlier than that, of Native Americans. My ancestors, I belong to a Native American tribe, the Lenape tribe. And do you know that when the Puritans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when they were coming over to this continent, do you know what their logo was for their company? Have any of you studied that? The logo of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Native American with a bow in one hand and arrows in the other, and there's this word bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "Come over here and help us." More like, "Come over here and kill us," is what it was. But of course, they didn't know about the disease, but when Governor Winthrop noticed that the land had been cleared, disease had decimated that area, he gave thanks to God for preparing the way for their religious community. So there's a little bit of a perhaps racist or ethnic bias there when we think that it was the whites who came and founded this country. The founders of our country weren't then in the early 1600s. It was in the late 1700s, a century and a half later, when our founders of the United States of America wanted nothing to do with the colonial divisiveness. If there's one thing about religion, and religion can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but there's one thing about all religions that we can say without any question. Religion is divisive. Religion builds walls. Even if it's a good religion. Religion sets up insiders versus outsiders. There's plenty of reason in the world for social conflict without religion. Without religion, we're still going to be fighting over this or that, territory or resources or what. But religion introduces this totally unnecessary and tragic source of social conflict. And it makes the saved versus the damned, the believers versus the infidels, the chosen versus the Gentiles. You know, we are the special. And I used to feel that way when I was a Christian. I was so happy that I was born in the right family, in the right religion, in the right country, in the right time of history, and I got to be a soldier for Jesus in the end times, you know, waiting for Jesus. We all felt that way. And if you were raised in a religion, you feel like yours has something really pure and special, and the others are a little off in some way, or way off, so bad that you're going to have to start a 30 years war to fight over that. It's true that many religious people are peaceful. Most of them are not that violent unless they get riled up by a leader. But it's still also true that religion is divisive. It builds walls. Religion has a lot of good teachings in it. It would be surprising if religions don't. In fact, if you look at all the religions of the world, you will see a sort of common thread across them. Peace, love. You know, there's a lot of good in a lot of religions. There's some good in the Bible. Jesus said some good things mixed in with a lot of other not so good things. In fact, Thomas Jefferson took a pair of scissors to the New Testament. You can buy that, by the way. You can buy the Jefferson Bible right now. He took a pair of scissors and he cut it out. He cut out what he called it a dunghill. He cut out the crap. He wrote to John Adams and he said, I was looking for the good teachings of Jesus and I found some. There are some good teachings of Jesus, but it's like looking for a diamond in a dunghill. That's what he said to Adams. And he let it fall. The rest of it just fall to the floor. So you will find good teachings in Christianity and in Islam and in Judaism. You'll find them in all these religions. But those good things that are in all those religions, those aren't religious teachings. Those are human values. Those are values that unite all of us. They transcend religion. The values that are left over when you separate the human values, the peace, the love, the stuff that all human beings use to judge whether we even think a religion is good to start with, when you separate that out, what you're left with are religious values. And religious values are not good. They may not be harmful. They might be things like how women should dress, or what day of the week you should worship, or what rituals, or how many times you should do that, or what food you can eat. Those are not really good moral values. Those are religious values. So Thomas Jefferson and the other founders, they realized that the divisiveness of religion was a problem. It was a scourge. They didn't want any part of that. They thought, our founders thought when they went to the Constitutional Convention and then later when they crafted the Bill of Rights, that human beings should be free. We should all be free from any type of authority above us in this proud and rebellious nation that we live. So they wrote that Constitution that is godless. The Declaration of Independence does mention a deity, although Jefferson, as we know, was deistic. Jefferson once called himself a Christian, but that was only after he cut the Bible into little pieces, and what was left, he said, okay, if that's what it means to be a Christian, okay, you can call me a Christian. But of course, would anybody today think that's what you should do to be a Christian? Cut out all the crap and then, leave the rest? But our founders, the Declaration of Independence, of course, if you read what it actually says, in spite of this references to a deistic God, which is not the same as a theistic God. Theism is a belief in a personal God, a God who has thoughts and desires and writes books and gets mad and creates things, Deism is a belief in an impersonal God. And these 18th century Enlightenment deists were the pre-Darwinian freethinkers of their day, where they didn't understand how it all began. They thought there must have been some force. But in his practical life, people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and others, in their practical lives, they were basically atheistic. They didn't pray. They didn't think there was any being to talk to. They basically lived like human beings. So the Declaration of Independence, if you read what it says, is actually quite anti-biblical. There's nothing about Christianity. There's nothing about Jesus in there. If you read that the consent of the governed, that's not in the Bible. In the Bible, human beings are worms and sinners and do not have. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. Lean not on your own understanding. And in the New Testament, bring into captivity every thought unto the obedience of Christ. There's not freedom. Those are not, the principles of the Declaration of Independence are not biblical. They are human. They're humanistic. They're democratic principles. that are vast improvement over Christianity. So then they later went on to write the Bill of Rights, and then, there was some debate about whether we even needed a Bill of Rights, because the Constitution is only supposed to grant specific enumerated powers, and anything else you can assume the government doesn't have the right to do. But it was good that our founders decided, let's go ahead and spell it out. The Bill of Rights does not grant us our rights. The Bill of Rights acknowledges our rights. The government doesn't grant you the right to your freedom of thought. You have it. We all have it as human beings. We run this country. We, the people, think it through. And the Bill of Rights, the very First Amendment, that First Amendment spells out 5 freedoms. And some people consider those 5 freedoms to be collectively known as the freedoms of conscience: religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Those 5 freedoms are not granted, but acknowledged in the First Amendment. But notice that before those 5 freedoms are spelled out, before any of those freedoms are even mentioned, first there's a non-freedom that's given. There's a restriction that's given before our private human freedoms are acknowledged. The very first words of the very First Amendment of the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then it says, or prohibiting the free exercise of religion, and going on from there. So before those freedoms, there's a non-freedom given, not on the people, but on the government. The people have the freedom to speak. And in a lot of these lawsuits that we take, we do a lot of educating in radio shows and TV shows and all sorts of educating about the importance of state-church separation. We have to continue to remind people in places like Whiteville, Tennessee, who has a big cross up on the water tower, or in DeSoto County, Mississippi, where they're praying over the loudspeakers before high school football games, in the name of Jesus. We have to remind them that when we are asking the government to be neutral on religious grounds, we're not attacking you. We're not going after your freedoms. We're not suing you. We're not barging into your churches. We're not stopping you from putting nativity scenes on your front lawn. We're not telling you you can't pray. We are suing the government under that establishment clause, the first part of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment. And a very simple way to illustrate that is just simply to say, there's a difference between free speech and government speech. If you're ever wrestling with an issue about whether something is constitutional or not under the Establishment Clause, just think in your mind, is this the government speaking, or is this the people speaking? When the people speak, we have our freedoms. When the government speaks, it doesn't. The government must curtail itself. The government must fold its arms and neither advance nor inhibit religion. The government can acknowledge, in some cases, can acknowledge religion, of course. Religion is a part of the history of our country. And even then, some acknowledgments, we think, at the Freedom from Religion Foundation go way too far. But the government cannot endorse or inhibit. The government must be neutral when it comes to its own speech. So if you see a nativity scene, is that permitted or not? It might be. If that nativity scene is in a public forum and everybody sees that that's the First Baptist Church putting it there and they have a permit for it, that's not the government speaking, that's the First Baptist Church speaking. Everybody can see that. And when their permit is over, they take it down, right? But if it's on the steps of the city hall owned by the city, and it's there, and it's the city that lights it and maintains it, and it's the city's putting it up, well, that's city speech. That's different. That is unconstitutional. Although there have been some cases, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what O'Connor said in the Lynch decision, where a nativity scene can be a small part of a larger display in some special cases. But keep that in mind when you're thinking about the importance of separation of church and state. Is this us, the people? We have our freedoms? Or is it the government itself speaking? When there's a government actor, if you were ever elected to a government position, high school principal or a mayor or whatever, you must hang your personal religious views on the door when you are acting as the government official. We sued Governor Perry of Texas this last summer because he was using his office as governor to invite, to organize, to promote this prayer and fasting rally because I can't do it on my own. I need the help of Jesus. Our state's in big trouble. He prayed for rain, and then the state caught fire, you know. So, what are we going to do, you know? That's like what Mark Twain said. You know, it's better to check the weather report before you pray for rain, you know. But, and we thought it was inappropriate. Governor Perry, as an individual, can go to church. He can have his views. He can attend meetings. We weren't trying to stop him from going to that meeting. We were trying to stop him from endorsing it, from arranging it as a state function. That's the difference. If it's Rick Perry speaking, by the way, after our lawsuit, which a conservative judge threw out on standing, not on the merits, but threw it out on standing. After our lawsuit, we went to the rally in Houston, 170-degree heat, 107, and protested in that. And he showed up, and he was introduced as Rick Perry of Austin, Texas. He was not introduced as the governor, you know, and I think our lawsuit had an effect on that. At least we like to pretend that it did. And that we need to remind public officials that when you're acting as your official capacity as principal or as high school teacher, you have to back off and be neutral. You don't have to change your views, but you just can't use your office. You can't abuse your public trust to promote your private views. You can't do that. Back in the late 1800s here in Wisconsin, there was a very important case. In the mid to late 1800s, they used to read the Bible in public schools. Every day there would be a reading from the Bible. And a family complained. And let me read to you the decision out of the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. A family complained about the Bible reading in the public schools. The lower court ruled against the family, but the Supreme Court overturned it. And Justice Harlow Orton of the Supreme Court of Wisconsin in 1890, it's called Weiss versus Board of Education. He wrote these words: "There is no such source and cause of strife, quarrel, fights, malignant opposition, persecution, and war, and all evil in the state as religion." This is part of the decision. These words are in the Supreme Court decision. "Let religion once enter our civil affairs, our government would soon be destroyed. Let it once enter our common schools, they would be destroyed. Those who made our Constitution saw this and used the most apt and comprehensive language in it to prevent such a catastrophe." Now those are strong words. Strife, quarrel, fights, persecution, destroyed, catastrophe, talking about religion in the schools. Well, that decision outlawed Bible reading in Wisconsin schools since 1890, the Weiss decision. And by the way, 73 years later, in 1963, in the Schempp decision, which outlawed prayers in the United States Supreme Court, Justice Brennan cited this Wisconsin Supreme Court. In fact, he cited these words, showing that religion is divisive when it comes into the public schools and the public spheres. By the way, Harlow Orton was the mayor of Madison. And you know Orton Park, that was named after that same judge. So here's a question. What kind of family do you think it was that complained about the Bible reading in Wisconsin public schools? Who do you think it was? Jewish? Do you think it was an atheist family? Do you think it was Annie Laurie Gator's great-grandmother? Christians? Somebody got it right. It was a Roman Catholic family. The Edgerton schools. And you know why? They were reading the King James Bible. The Wisconsin schools were reading from the Protestant King James Bible. And the Catholics in Edgerton said, that's not fair. The state is picking sides. That's not right. Back then, Roman Catholicism was a very tiny minority. They were kind of like the Amish or the Jewish. They were not, like since the 1940s, the Roman Catholics have come into their own in this country. But back then, Roman Catholics were taking the lead in some of these state church lawsuits because they were one of the minorities that the First Amendment is designed to protect from the tyranny of the majority. The majority does not have the right to tyrannize the minority. It was a Roman Catholic family that complained, and they won that lawsuit. And thanks to the Roman Catholics, we now no longer have Bible reading in the public schools. Now you might ask, well, what's the big deal? I mean, why were they so upset? I mean, why couldn't they just ignore it? I mean, well, you'll have to ask them. That's the whole point of the First Amendment. Many people would say, it's no big deal. In God we trust on our money, well, just ignore it. I mean, why are you so upset about it? In God we trust on our money. And usually what I respond is, well, if it's no big deal, you wouldn't miss it if it were gone then, would you, right? But of course it is a big deal to them. They do think it's a big deal. So what O'Connor said in her decision, in the Lynch decision, which by the way did allow a limited way for the nativity scene, Justice O'Connor, in a concurring opinion in the Lynch versus Donnelly case, Supreme Court case in 1984, talked about whether the government can endorse. Can the government pick sides? Can the schools in Wisconsin pick the Protestant Bible over the Catholic Bible? Of course, today we think, well, no. But back then it was a big issue they were struggling with. Here's what she said. Endorsement sends a message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the political community. Disapproval sends the opposite message. And there you go. You might think it's no big deal unless you're in one of those minorities where you do feel the majority is, you know, am I a true Wisconsinite? Am I a true American? Am I being tolerated? Or am I part of we the people? It says in God we trust on our money, but to be accurate it should say in God some of us trust. Now there's more and more people who don't believe in God or trust in God, and that phrase is less and less apt. By the way, that phrase is a Johnny-come-lately. Did you know that? Our original motto was E pluribus unum, which means out of many come one. And it was in the 1950s, after McCarthyism and the scare of communist, red communist, evil, godless communism, that religious opportunists got that phrase, in God we trust, put on our dollar bills, on all currency. In fact, I have a pre-1954 dollar bill here that doesn't have it. If you have any money before 1957, actually, when they started printing it. And in God we trust. Who in Congress would dare be seen voting against God in the mid-1950s? There were a lot of bad laws passed on state-church separation in the 1950s. It's now become our national motto, and we're stuck with it. And it's now engraved. We tried to sue. It's now engraved in the visitor center of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. When you walk in, there it says, in God we trust, engraved on the wall. We tried to stop that, but we were denied standing on trying to stop that really flagrant abuse. Because what's it saying to those of us? It's just like when the Catholics in Edgerton were feeling like, you know, this isn't right that the government's taking sides. What about us non-believers? What about us atheists and agnostics who don't believe and don't trust in God? What business does our government have to interfere, to say to me that I do trust in God as an American citizen? Is that right? Is that fair? Some people might say, well, just ignore it, just don't look at it. But you know, what if it said, in Jesus we trust? Would you tell the Jews, well, just ignore it. We're a Christian country, but we're tolerating you Jews. You can be in our country too. We'll let you, you know. So the basic idea is an idea of fairness. It's an idea of equality, freedom and justice for all Americans. Thomas Jefferson, if you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see the Jefferson Memorial. Have some of you been there? It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful setting. And the main saying, there's a lot of his sayings that are there, but the big saying that goes all the way around the top inside of it when you read it, is that saying of his where he says, I have sworn eternal hostility to all forms of tyranny over the mind. That's not quite the exact, I have the exact quote here. And what a wonderful saying, that Jefferson was opposing tyranny over the minds of men. What an American concept, that we are free to think what we want. We are free to have our beliefs or not beliefs. But listen exactly to this quote in context. What was the tyranny that Jefferson was talking about? The Revolutionary War had been fought and won decades earlier. What was the tyranny that was in Jefferson's mind when he wrote that phrase? Let me read you some of the letter. He wrote a letter to a friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was talking about the First Amendment. Here it is. That clause of the Constitution, which, while it secured the freedom of the press, covered also the freedom of religion, had given to the clergy a very favorite hope of obtaining an establishment of a particular form of Christianity through the United States. And as every sect believes its own form, the true one, everyone perhaps hoped for his own, but especially the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists. The returning good sense of our country threatens abortion to their hopes, and they believe that any portion of power confided in me will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe rightly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. In other words, the tyranny he was talking about here is the tyranny of establishing a religion. By the way, that phrase altar of God, as all lowercase, he didn't use the capital letter G, God, which would be the Christian God. He didn't believe in the Christian God or the biblical God. That was sort of a phrase of the day, the altar of God. He was a deist. He was not an atheist, but he used phrases like that. And in his mind, God was not this being, but it was almost nature itself. So, in Jefferson's election, the religious right of this state thought he was this horrible infidel. What's he going to do? He's not going to let us establish our church. Horrible. And so that phrase is talking about opposition, eternal hostility, opposed to the tyranny of establishing a state religion. Now, also notice that in the First Amendment, the phrase says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Some people say, well, it just means the government can't establish an official state religion. No, that's not what it just means. Look at that word, respecting. The word respecting is there for a reason. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which means dealing with or leaning towards or having anything to do with an establishment of religion. Which is why a nativity scene on the Green Bay City Hall doesn't establish any religion, does it? But it was still unconstitutional. If a high school teacher gets up and leads the class in prayer, is that establishing a religion? No, it's not establishing a form of religion, but it's unconstitutional. It's respecting the establishment of religion. Some people think, well, aren't we a democracy? Don't we have majority rule in this country? Can't a local community decide what it wants to do? And, what if we vote? Can't we vote to have this be a Roman Catholic city? Can't we do that? No, you can't. Because we are a constitutional republic. We're a democracy, but our Constitution has some principles in it that are hardwired, that are not up to vote. In our Constitution, there are some things that are established, hardwired, you can't vote away by a local majority. For example, there are some counties in the South, there were some, and maybe there still are some, who, based on a proud, long tradition, a long history in their area, would vote to segregate their schools. You know that some counties would do that. Can they? Can the local majorities come in and say, we have voted, we are now going to segregate our schools? Well, look what had to happen. Federal troops had to come in because the Constitution overrides the local majority on specific things. Not on everything, but the specific things. A city cannot vote, or a state cannot vote to kick out all the newspapers. We have freedom of the press. There's no way a local majority is going to vote that away. Freedom of assembly. Religious freedom is one of those things. No local majority can vote away. We are often accused of being outsiders coming in to meddle with the local community. We took a lawsuit in Dayton, Tennessee, Ray County, Tennessee, which, by the way, was where the Scopes trial was held in 1925. The legacy of the Scopes trial was William Jennings Bryan College, Bryan College there in Dayton, Tennessee, which is an evangelical college, which was sending Bible students into the public school 5th grade classrooms for an hour a week while the teachers just left. And they were doing Jesus Loves Me and Noah's Ark and you need to come to God and all that. They were basically evangelizing during school time. And we took that lawsuit and it was a slam dunk. The entire school board voted to keep the Bible class, and so did the entire county board. And but it was clear this is established law. You can't do something like that. But they accused us of being out. We you know, just like in Kentucky, they have a history of the Davy Crockett and their respect. Well, in our community, our history is the Bible. How can you come down here and tell us we can't do that? Another town in Tennessee, just this year, Whiteville. I mentioned this already, about an hour outside of Memphis. And by the way, Whiteville is the name of some person. To their credit, it appears that the council there is pretty well integrated, so it's not a Whiteville, it's Whiteville. They say Whiteville. They had a big Christian cross on the water tower. And about a year ago, our attorney, Rebecca Markert, complained, said you can't have a Christian cross on the city-owned water tower. He ignored it, and she wrote again, I think. Is Patrick here? Patrick? How many letters did they send out?
I don't know, 2 or 3. Well, it was lighted at night, and they shut off the lights finally after.
Oh, yeah. Patrick's one of our attorneys at the foundation. Rebecca's not here, is she? Anybody else here from the foundation? We got an attorney in Nashville, Alvin Harris, who, by the way, who had won our case in Dayton, Tennessee. He wrote a letter to the mayor of Whiteville saying, you need to take that cross down or we are going to sue you. Take it down by the end of October or we will sue your city. And boy, that mayor got all persecution complex. These outsiders interfering with our local values. There was local complaining. Right? It wasn't like we're going around looking for problems. There were people in that town complaining about that cross. And he called us terrorists. He said, we're coming in, we're terrorizing their community. And it's kind of still not resolved. We thought we had a victory there, but he took it on himself to get a big crane. I think, what did it cost? $4,000 or something to get a crane. And they broke off one of the arms of the cross. Changed it from one execution symbol to another. And it stands there today. There's this deformed one-armed Jesus, I guess. And they're still lighting it, I think. And anyway, we're going to have to threaten to, because now they're, and then recently everybody put crosses up, and they don't get it. The people in town said, oh yeah, we're going to, so they all bought crosses and put them in their front yards and everything, and we think, great, that's free speech. That's not government speech. You can do that. We're not trying to stop you from advertising religion. We're trying to enforce the First Amendment prohibition against the government speaking and doing this. And so we just saw pictures that the mayor, I guess, put some crosses right at the City Hall building. So I guess we're still going to have to keep going after them. We're going to write to them, right, Patrick? Oh, most okay. Patrick, we just hired our 4th full-time attorney. Did Andrew come tonight? No? Okay. And we can't get the work done. There's so many. Our 4th full-time attorney plus intern, right? Kristen, right? Kristen Fox is one of the interns. She's not here though, right? Oh, she has class, okay. But her fiance is here, so. Anyway, in cases like that, and they don't see that distinction. If someone could just sit down and say, look, we're not interfering with you. You have the freedom. It's the government. That's why it's important to understand the government itself must be neutral, must back off, must not endorse or inhibit religion. It would be just as wrong for some city to get up and put a sign up that says there is no God and Jesus is a myth. That would be just as bad. In fact, would we complain about that? I suppose we would have to, wouldn't we? A city shouldn't be doing something like that. The Supreme Court has established a test called the Lemon Test. And that test has been used a lot, and now that test is coming under some fire. But the Lemon Test has been a very successful test on the Establishment Clause regarding whether an action by a government is constitutional or not under the Establishment Clause. And it's a three-pronged test. The government has to pass all three of them. If it fails any one of the three, then it's unconstitutional. The first prong of the lemon test is that the government must have a secular purpose for what it does. A secular government can only have a secular purpose. A secular government cannot be doing religious things, cannot be organizing or promoting or hindering religion. It must have a secular purpose. The law itself must have some basic overriding secular non-religious purpose. Second, it must have a primary effect which neither advances nor hinders religion. So it might be that a government has a spotless secular purpose, but in the real world it turns out that it's giving an advantage to some religion or another. Well, then that effect, that primary effect, must not advance or hinder religion. If it does, then it's unconstitutional. And the third prong is that it must avoid excessive entanglement between religion and government. So you can't have the church, for example, functioning as an arm of the government, doing some government function. Like in some countries, the churches, took care of all the marriage and births and census and all those things. And so a law to be constitutional, or an action of the government at any level to be constitutional, must pass those tests. And then there's a fourth prong that's sometimes added, and that's political effect on it. O'Connor had sort of made her own test of endorsement. If it looks like this government is endorsing, then that is wrong. We have been thrown out of court a number of times, wrongly, because it's claimed that, well, we're not coerced. That's what happened with our complaint of Governor Perry. By the way, I wrote a song for Governor Perry when I was down there in Houston this summer, called "Get Off Your Knees and Get to Work." I dedicated it to Governor Rip Van Periwinkle, who overslept not 30 but 2,030 years. And one of the lines in the song says, "Faith won't fix the budget, prayer won't pay the bill, hope will never nudge it, but taxing churches will." And the judge there in that case threw us out on standing, did not rule that what the governor was doing was okay. This has happened to us a number of times. Standing is a big sticky thing right now. Who has the right to even take the lawsuit? The judge basically said to us, well, nobody was forcing you to go to that meeting. There was no coercion involved, so you're not injured. You can't. The courts can only deal with cases and controversies. They can only deal with some issue, and since you're not injured and you're not, then you can just look the other way. Well, our attorney tried to point out that that's not the test. Coercion is not the test. It doesn't matter if you're coerced or not. If the government is promoting someone else's religion, it's the neutrality that's the test. The government must be neutral. And if the government is not acting neutrally, even if you're not coerced, those Catholic students in Edgerton, they could have just ignored it and said their own Reims Douay version of the Bible in their own minds, right? They weren't coerced, were they? They were just... But the government was endorsing. The government was taking a side. In this country, we are free to disagree about religious issues. That's part of what makes our country great. Nobody's going to come and arrest us for standing on our heads, speaking in tongues, and praying to Mother Goose. I mean, this is America. We can do whatever you want, and people do whatever they want. This is great. We are free to disagree, but one thing we are not free to do is to ask our government to settle the argument. The government must back off. The government must just say, hey, this is not our job. You fight it out among yourselves. You people figure it out. You can have your disagreement. You can assemble. You can argue. You can have your debates. You can proselytize. You can stand up in the street and pray to Jesus or to Muhammad or whatever. I debated a Muslim a couple weeks ago in the University of Minnesota, and the audience was at least half Muslim. And the women with their Batman kind of, blacked up. And really sweet people, really nice people. And the guy, Hamza Sorsis was his name. And I started my debate by saying, the Muslims say there is no God but Allah. And I have to say, I agree with the first 2/3 of that sentence. But he and I were free. Hamza and I were free to disagree. We had our debate, we had our argument, but then we couldn't go to the state of Minnesota and say, okay, pick a winner. You can't do that. Not in America, where there's total freedom of thought. So I think basically that sums up the importance of the separation of church and state, because it's important to America that we are free. We all have the freedom to disagree or believe or not. And as Ann Gaylor says, who is one of the 3 founders, along with Annie Roy Gaylor, another man, of the Freedom from Religion Foundation back in 1978, she says, there can be no religious freedom without the freedom to dissent. That freedom to dissent is what makes America so wonderful. That freedom to say no, that freedom to be an equal, full participant, a full member of the political community, regardless of your beliefs or lack thereof. That is why state-church separation is so important. So you want to do questions now, Mike?
Hey everybody, we're going to do some Q&A, so keep your questions short and to the point. Anyone want to start it off? No. Have people come out, whatever.
I find it interesting that in comparison to the United States, Europe is, although in many countries they have official religions, they're far less religious, and their governments seem to be in better shape in that sense because they don't seem to have intertwined religion and government, even though they have a state religion. Could you comment on that? Why perhaps the United States seems to be so different, even though the Constitution says one thing?
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? We have separation of church and state, and yet we're so much more religious than countries that don't have it. Phil Zuckerman, in his book, Societies Without God, looked at a whole bunch of countries around the world, and he focused on Scandinavia, especially on Denmark. He went to Denmark and found out that about 4% of the Danes actually believe in God, although a lot of them will get married in church, and religion is kind of a cultural thing. They don't really believe it. And yet Denmark is probably, by any measure, the most successful country anywhere for its economy, its equality, its happiness, its well-being, its health care, and so on. The least religious countries tend to be the better off, and the more dysfunctional countries tend to be more religious. And maybe that's because if things are going bad, you need to reach out and pray to something above, maybe that's part of the explanation. But when things get better, you don't pray as much. You don't need God as much. When your life is put together more. I spoke in Australia last year, and I emceed the big banquet at the Atheist Conference. And I said, some of you Australians are probably scratching your head at us Americans. Like, how come we're so religious? How come America is so obsessed with religion? What's wrong with us? And if it's not because we haven't failed to switch over to metric, maybe that's one of the reasons. I think it's because both of our countries were founded by rejects from England. You got the prisoners and we got the Puritans. So maybe that explains, maybe that's part of the explanation. But when you think about it, if you do have a state religion, and the church is being paid by state money, like 1% of everybody's taxes went to pay the church upkeep and the salaries and all that, well then the pastor doesn't have to hustle. No matter who comes, they're going to get paid, right? Here in this country, it's a free market. It's an open marketplace. Every street on every corner has got to get out and hustle because the government's not paying their bills. That's probably the price of freedom. We have to put up with that, and we should welcome it. Even though we think some of the views are kooky, we need to embrace and welcome that diversity in this country. But it is kind of a nice sign that seems to be abating, that groups like these and young people seem to be rising and getting less religious as time goes by.
This is kind of a question that came up in one of our meetings was that by doing lawsuits for, say, taking down crosses or removing activity scenes and whatnot, are you not giving atheists and non-believers undue negative PR? I mean, are you not making life more difficult for someone without faith, because now they have that stigma of you guys are trying to take our religion away?
Well, you could ask that about any reform or any cause. I mean, would you say to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, you're giving women a bad name, you're agitating for suffrage for the vote, why don't you just not be some troublemakers? And of course, some of the greatest women heroes in our history are the troublemakers, the ones that were out there unafraid. But often when we take our lawsuits, we are joined by religious people. When we complained over the nativity scene at Green Bay at City Hall, it wasn't just us atheists. There was a Catholic family, there was a Protestant family, there was a Jewish family, there was a Wiccan family that joined us, because many religious people also understand the importance of state-church separation. They realize that if you mix religion and government, they both get dirty. And there's a lot of people like Greg Boyd, who's a megachurch pastor in Minneapolis area, in the Twin Cities area. He's an evangelical conservative, and he and I have done a couple of debates. And he wrote a book, America's Not a Christian Nation. And it never was, and it shouldn't be. And it's not a Christian nation because where does it say, He points out that the treaty with Tripoli, for example, is explicitly declared the United States is not in any sense based on the Christian religion. He thinks that it is wrong to use the power of the government to push a religion. That's why he doesn't endorse candidates or invite candidates into his church. He thinks that Christianity should be spread by persuasion only. Our love for the world and our gospel message, we should be all, you don't use the government. So we are often joined by religious people who do get it. And that makes our cases stronger. When we sued over the Ten Commandments monument in La Crosse, Wisconsin, in Cameron Park there, we were also joined by Jews and Unitarians and Protestants and Catholic. It was a Catholic monument. It had the Catholic version of the Ten Commandments on it. And so it wasn't, to the court it didn't look like it was just a bunch of mad atheists trying to cause some trouble. It was Americans who believe in the principle of keeping religion and government separate. And I think most Christians support the principle, at least on paper, I think. It's only the extremists, it's only the right-wingers that are still pushing for some kind of a theocracy or for some kind of Christian influence in our country. So if it's a bad name, well then we'll take that rap,
On the other hand, are you actually pushing people towards religion? Oh, I would have agreed with you, but you're so rabid, now I've gone back to the church.
Yeah, we hear that a lot. Yeah, we hear that a lot. I don't know about rabid. What's rabid? What's more important than fighting for the First Amendment? What's rabid about American freedom? But you're right, some people say that. All those crosses that went up in Whiteville. And when we stopped prayers over the loudspeakers at Southern football games, Stephanie did a lot of those. Our attorney Stephanie Schmidt wrote a lot of those letters. A lot of the people said, "Oh yeah, you can't stop us from praying." And so for a couple of weeks, the Christian communities just got all excited. They printed T-shirts and they had rallies. And that first football game, when there were no prayers over the loudspeakers, a bunch of parents ran down to the 50-yard line and they said the Lord's Prayer out loud. See, we're going to show you. And they credited us with causing a revival in their town. Well, it didn't last too long. But still, it's like they feel, it's kind of like Jesus. And Jesus said some good things, and he said some kind of crazy things too. And one of the crazy things he said was, if he even existed or even said these things, he demonstrated the kind of paranoia of a small town cult leader when he said, "He that is not with me is against me." He couldn't see that there's a middle ground. You're either for me or you're against me. And there's a lot of right-wing believers who have this attitude. Well, if you're pushing for neutrality, they can't distinguish between neutrality and hostility. They think neutrality is hostility because we're not letting them abuse the government to use the government as a billboard for their views. When we ask the government to honor the Establishment Clause, they interpret it as an attack. We are attacking them. When in fact we're not. We are guarding their freedoms as well. Because this week, if the government is pushing your religion this week, whose religion are they pushing next week, right? So So yeah, that does happen, but that's going to happen. It's America.
I was wondering if you could comment on the Christmas tree in the state capitol. Since the governor is now calling it a Christmas tree, not a holiday tree.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Recall of
I have to say for legal reasons, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is not a political organization. So we can't take positions on political, we take positions after the fact. We'll sue after the fact. So although you're welcome to talk to some of our staff members privately about some of their views on the governor, but we all know that in 1985, Governor Earl decided for inclusivity to call it a holiday tree. That was civil. That was good. It didn't hurt anybody's feelings. It didn't exclude anybody. That tree, by the way, is, you know, Christians can call it a Christmas tree if they want to, but it long predated Christianity. Christians basically stole Christmas, if you know that whole history of that. That's a pagan thing. In fact, many atheists and agnostics will bring in an evergreen tree during this time of the year. And they'll call it a solstice tree or whatever, a holiday tree. And in fact, our family has done that a few times. And we don't put an angel on top, but maybe a butterfly or some other natural. It's a natural tree, a natural symbol during, the real reason for the season is the winter solstice. The shortest and darkest day of the year. And for millennia, human cultures in the northern hemisphere have taken this time to wish for the coming spring. So festivals of light, and the evergreen signified the green spring that was coming. And so the holly wreath, by the way, the holly wreath is a fertility symbol. I won't get too graphic about it, the shape of it, but anyway, we non-believers are happy to share that holiday tree with Christians. It's their country too, you know, it's our country, but that's not a Christmas tree. It's a state tree recognizing the holiday that belongs to all of us. So it's a real slap in the face of diversity and inclusiveness for a governor to rename it a Christmas tree. That's like saying the rest of you are political outsiders. There's only the true Wisconsinites. We all know that the real Wisconsinites celebrate Christmas. When of course, what about all the Jews? What about the Wiccans and the Buddhists and the atheists who don't? So we don't oppose the tree. It's just the name of the tree that we oppose. By the way, that rotunda, it's the first floor they call it, but it's actually the second floor. That rotunda has been used and designated as a public forum. So you can get a permit to go to the rotunda to put up your own private views, which are not viewed as government speech. So you'll see a menorah there sometimes, but it's not the state of Wisconsin's menorah. Is it the Lubavitch people who put it up? I forget who puts that menorah up. And we have a sign up every year. We don't think our sign should be there, but as a protest, and at equal time, we have a sign that's been up there for, I think, 16, 17 years now, a winter solstice sign next to usually it's next to the bust of La Follette there. At this season of the winter solstice, may reason prevail. There are no gods, no devils, no heaven, no hell. There's only our natural world. Religion is but myth and superstition that hardens hearts and enslaves minds. That sign's been up there as our own speech, not government speech. In fact, it's become something of a tourist attraction. There's sometimes these busloads of little old ladies from Indiana. Let's get our picture by the atheist sign. But the tree is not private speech. The tree is government speech. That tree belongs to the state. It's bought by the state. It's put up and maintained by the state. That is state speech for all of us. That's not a Christmas tree.
Hey, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the tax-exempt status of churches, and maybe in particular the ongoing lawsuit you have about the pastor's housing allowance, because that seemed especially outrageous, and I think not many people know about that.
Yeah, churches get some great tax advantages. We don't like the fact that churches are tax exempt, but that's not an issue we're going to sue over. Or if we do, it won't be for a long time. There are arguments on both sides of that. Any nonprofit organization is tax exempt. Our organization is tax exempt. There's a big difference though in part 2 of our current lawsuit that you mentioned. We might go ahead and challenge the special favoritism that churches are getting and not having to be accountable. Churches and religious organizations don't have to file these extensive 990 forms to the IRS which show where every penny comes from and how it's spent. We do. Every nonprofit that's not religious has to do that. In fact, you can go online and you can see my salary. You can see Patrick's salary. You can see how every penny that comes in. You can see how we are accountable. We have to earn our tax exemption. And churches make the argument, well, we're doing such good things for society that we should not have to pay taxes. But of course, if the church catches fire, who do they call? Right? They don't put out their own fire. They take advantage of the taxes. But the lawsuit that we just took, that you just referred to, refers to not to the churches themselves, but to ministers. There is a special wording in the tax code, which was inserted in the 1950s to help ministers fight our common enemy. In fact, it says ministers of the gospel. In the IRS tax code, it says ministers of the gospel to fight the enemy, our common enemy. Do not have to report their housing as income. So if you're a minister of the gospel, a preacher, a priest, a rabbi is considered a minister of the gospel under the IRS code, believe it or not, or any other clergy, then your rent or your house payment and any reasonable expenses are excluded from income. It's not an exemption or a deduction, it's just an exclusion. You don't even have to report it. I used to do that. When I was a minister, I used to do that. Hey, why not? If there's a tax break, we're all going to take it, right? So my rent every year, I just did not report that as income. I was able to just subtract that. It's a huge break that ministers get, and it's being abused. Even if it weren't being abused, it's wrong. We're challenging it that it's unfair. It's being abused because what does that mean, minister of the gospel? There are basketball coaches at a Catholic high school that are claiming it. There are people that are involved in all sorts, in any kinds of ways that they say, well, listen, I'm a minister of the gospel. What does it take to become a minister of the gospel? The IRS is in the business now of having to decide who is or who isn't a minister of the gospel, right? And there should not be that entanglement between religion and government. So it's unfair. When I was a minister, I used to get that excluded. When I was working for God, I got to take that break. But now that I'm working against the idea of a God, now that I'm convinced that the belief in God is irrational, and even incoherent, and even dangerous and morally questionable, now that I'm working against what I used to work for, I no longer get that. Our nonprofit organization and the Red Cross and other groups are doing good work in the world, but don't get that exemption, that exclusion, excuse me. So we're suing. We've sued in federal court, right here, just a few blocks from here in the federal court building, on the constitutionality of the IRS granting this special favor to religious leaders. We think it's wrong. It came to our attention because you know who Rick Warren is? Yeah. That big pastor in California, Saddleback Church. He said the opening prayer at Obama's first inaugural, and he wrote that big book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Years ago, Rick Warren was having his church stipulate that his entire salary was a housing allowance. So he was reporting no income for years and years and years. He was cheating us. He was cheating the government. He was cheating all of us by doing that. So there was a lawsuit that he lost, except they didn't grandfather it in. He lost the lawsuit saying that you can't do that. You have to only exclude a fair market value. You can't say your whole salary is a housing allowance. It has to be a basic, fair, and that includes things like furniture and remodeling and your swimming pool and other stuff too. I mean, it's pretty generous what it is. So he got off the hook, but now his housing allowance now has to be a fair housing allowance. So what we've done in our lawsuit, we took it in California at first, but then we realized because of another decision that our standing would probably be very shaky to sue as taxpayers. Taxpayer standing is getting harder and harder to get into court with. if not impossible now, on establishment clause. What we did was we pulled out and we reconfigured it, and we just refiled here in Wisconsin. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has designated for me and Annie Laurie as co-presidents of the group to have a housing allowance. Part of our salary, it didn't change anything, but now part of our salary is designated as a housing allowance. We have that, but we don't get to claim it. So we think that's going to strengthen, if not guarantee, our standing to show that we've been injured. It's not just that we don't like what the government's doing, but we have been materially injured in some way because of the advantage that the clergy are getting. So watch that lawsuit. So far it's been something of a sleeper. There have been some stories about it, but you can bet that if we win, there's going to be a lot of noise.
There seems to be a prevailing notion that Christians are now a persecuted minority in their 80%. And it's really been taken up by the O'Reillys and the Limbos, etc. I'm kind of curious if you have an opinion as to when the religious right or the political right overtook the religious right, and they became fused.
Yeah, I think we can pretty much point to the general time of the beginning of the moral majority, Jerry Falwell and all of that. I was a minister before that time, and I and most of my friends were kind of apolitical. I mean, we voted and we cared and we voted our values and that, but we weren't so involved in any strong political way. But along with Reagan and Falwell, and suddenly this idea that pastors could marshal the vote, you know, that there was this religious bloc out there that could be voted. This is one of the things that Greg Boyd is opposed to, that churches should not be used to marshal the vote. People should have just vote their conscience. But so that moral majority, of course, folded, but there's still this idea that you still have to pander. Look at how a lot of the candidates today have to show how religious they are. Did you see one of those debates where Bachman and Perry and Ron Paul and Newt Gingrich and who else was on that? They were asked about, when you take the presidential oath of office that ends with "So help me God," what does that mean to you? And they all had to say, "Oh, how much it meant to us." Of course, they didn't realize the presidential oath of office doesn't have "So help me God" in it. If you read the Constitution, there's only one oath that's given, the oath for president, and it doesn't have "So help me God" or a Bible. It's a purely secular, and it could have, because there were states and there were colonies before that time that did have oaths that did have "So help me God," and they used some of them as a model, but they took out "So help me God." They wanted to be totally secular. So there's still this impression that I think it's not going to last forever. That you have to show, you have to wear your religion on your sleeve, you have to pander to piety, you have to, in order to get the particular vote for your base, you have to show how religious you are. So it is kind of new. Of course, religion and politics has been going on forever in our country, but this new wave of it is pretty virulent. In fact, I did a debate with Matthew Staver, who's the head of the Liberty Council, a legal group. In fact, they go against us sometimes in some of our lawsuits. We did a debate at Falwell's Liberty University School of Law last year on whether the Ten Commandments is the basis of American law. And Staver had to admit, well, no, it's not the basis, but it influenced American law. So, in fact, the debate was held they had a Supreme Court room, they had a mock-up of the U.S. Supreme Court. Imagine. And so we had our debate like we were justices of the U.S. Supreme Court in this, at Falwell's Liberty University. So his influence and the influence of the Pat Robertsons and the other religious right is strong and it's powerful. And you can see how strong it is because of this need to pander. But I don't know if they're counting, if anybody's counted on this current generation hitting the voting booth in the next 5, 10, 20 years. Because things are going to change.
You mentioned some of your cases failing on standing. In the cases where you fail to make it to court or lose your case, do you think that the judges' opinions are factoring into their decisions? And if they are, how do you overcome that?
Well, you can't, especially with the current Supreme Court. We're kind of stuck. Supreme Court has ruled. We took a case, we challenged George Bush's faith-based initiative. And it's arcane, it's kind of convoluted, and maybe it's too much to explain tonight, but on the Establishment Clause, there has been an exception made, the Flass decision and other decisions. An exception has been made so that taxpayers can challenge an unconstitutional abuse of governmental authority, expending tax dollars, right? Ordinarily, taxpayers can't take lawsuits. You can't sue the president over what country he invades or what photocopy machine she might buy. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, we elect them, but there is a special case where you can, under Establishment Clause, Religion Clause, as a taxpayer, go in and challenge. But we took that case, and our standing was knocked out. That we were not directly injured. We didn't have the same. There was no nexus. The federal court ruled against us on standing, not on the merits. They didn't say what Bush was doing was right or wrong. It's just that we couldn't sue. We went to the Chicago 7th Circuit and it was overturned. And Judge Posner wrote a great decision affirming our freedom to take the lawsuit. We went to the Supreme Court in 2007 and the Supreme Court flipped it back again and said no, because Congress had not specifically appropriated that exact amount of money to Bush to say spend it on faith-based initiative. Since there was no nexus there, even though Congress knew Bush was using the money for that reason. In fact, one of the Supreme Court justices said what Bush was doing might very well have been unconstitutional. He was abusing his office, using public money to promote religion. That we were knocked out on standing to take the lawsuit. So we didn't lose on the merits. We didn't get a decision saying it was okay for Bush. Same thing with Perry and his thing. The court didn't tell us that Perry was right to do what he did. It's just that we didn't have the standing. So since that decision, it's called the Hine decision. Hine is Freedom from Religion Foundation. Because we were winning. So Hine was the current faith-based czar, whatever they call him, challenged our victory and then it was overturned. So since that time, it's been harder to get into court on standing, and the courts have sat up and noticed, and the religious right has noticed, we can stop a lot of these lawsuits by challenging their standing, and they have been. So the bar's been raised. It's tougher. So you either have to prove a direct legislative money trail. If you can show that, this money was voted for this, and it goes for that, and the governor's supposed to do that with it, or a direct injury of some sort. You're a person who's been somehow directly injured. That's why we backed up. One of the reasons why we backed up, and we're taking this parsonage thing under a direct injury, not as taxpayers. We're not saying we're just American taxpayers opposed to it. We're saying we're American citizens injured by this governmental action.
The National Day of Prayer.
Yeah, National Day of Prayer, same thing. We won in federal court. Judge Crabb wrote a great decision. By the way, you should read her decision. She's here in Madison. Declaring, not only giving us standing, but declaring that it was unconstitutional for the president, or for Congress to tell the president to declare a National Day of Prayer. And then that was overturned. Our standing was overturned in federal court. Was that last year? Yeah, it was at least last year. The oral arguments were in December, so it was this year that our standing was overturned. So that was also unfortunate, and the judge, Easterbrook, it was a 3-judge panel, basically used the wrong argument. You basically used the coercion argument. Easterbrook basically said, in Mannion, said that you're not coerced. If the president gets up and declares a National Day of Prayer, you don't have to pay attention. There's no harm to you. And totally ignoring the neutrality test or the endorsement test. So we realized we could not appeal that loss of standing to the current U.S. Supreme Court. We've already been before the Supreme Court on the standing issue. So we have a loss, not on the merits. The court has not said that it's okay for the president to get up and declare a National Day of Prayer. In fact, we're fighting it at a lower level. We're fighting it in state courts now. We have a lawsuit in Arizona. Governor Breyer, how do you say her name, Brewer, has a National Day of Prayer, and in Colorado. So we're trying to find other ways to go after it. But the Supreme Court right now is kind of almost a shut door on when it comes to standing in these kind of cases.
It's happening quite prestigious.
Yeah. Montana.
From Montana.
You were asking a question? What's happening?
What's happened with that?
Yeah, in Montana, federal property, federal forest, there's a Knights of Columbus Roman Catholic Jesus statue standing like this by the ski slope, and the forest, what do they call it? The forest agents? Yeah, they decided not to renew the 10-year lease this time because that's actually a religious shrine. And that wasn't our decision to start with, but we supported them, saying that was good, and then everyone's blaming us, which is good. It's good they're blaming us because the publicity from it. So then a congressman, what's his name, Lundgren of Montana, got in on the act and forced the forest department to back off and have a period of public hearing. By the way, it goes until December 8th, so you can express your opinion if you want. Go to our webpage and there's instructions about how you can express your opinion about it. The Montanans are saying, what are you Wisconsinites meddling with our business here? Well, it's federal property. It's all of our business. And it's a shrine. It's known as a shrine. It's a Roman Catholic shrine. And now they're trying to say, well, it was a war memorial. Don't you care about veterans? You atheist Jew? I mean, you know, it's so meaningful to the war. You know, it was not a war memorial. It wasn't even designated as one, although there was a little bit of history there. So, and we think the whole idea of public comment is ludicrous anyway. Do you have public comment on the Bill of Rights? Would Governor Wallace have said, let's have public comment about whether we should segregate our schools? Is that what you do? Do you take a majority vote? But anyway, we'll have to wait to see what's going to happen. There's talk about maybe them swapping the land and turning it into private land. But right now it's too early to know what's going to happen.
Back to that standing thing. Who does have standing? Is it if nobody has standing, then what sort of argument is that?
Yeah, somebody with some direct injury would have standing. If it's a student in the school, parents who have students in the school who are subjected to that thing, right? If you're being discriminated against in some way, or if our organization has some direct injury, not just taxpayers, but the taxpayer standing is not totally dead. If you can show the nexus, if you can show the path, right? If Congress had said, here, George Bush, here's some money for the faith-based initiative, spend it on that, then we would have had standing. But the fact that Bush just took it out of the general appropriation that was not specifically allocated. So there are cases where standing would be
Actually a prayer. Who's
yeah.
taking the bullet for it?
Yeah, exactly. And we're kind of wondering. We're wondering, you know, in the oral arguments in Chicago on that issue, they basically said that, well, the only person who would have standing to sue would be the president himself, who's being forced by Congress to do this thing that he doesn't want to do. Because what if Congress said, you should declare a Roman Catholic nation? Well, then, you know, you obviously see that. Or perhaps somebody who was in the press room when the press secretary made the announcement and actually heard it physically there and their stomach knotted up, you know, something like that. Oh, I was hurt by that, you know, something like direct exposure of some sort, you know. So with like nativity scenes, you can show direct exposure. You drive by them, you see them. The Ten Commandments monuments, there's some exposure to this thing, but with a sort of a generic National Day of Prayer proclamation that you can ignore, you have to go searching for it to get your feelings hurt kind of thing, you know. So that's a good question, and we think there should not even be a question about standing on Bill of Rights issues, right? And why should there even be a question of if you're injured or not? If somebody's violating the Constitution, they're violating the Constitution, any American should be able to say, that's wrong. No, I challenge that. So that's what we think anyway.
Could you talk for a minute just about how you personally made the transition from a minister to who you are today? I mean, how that happened, you know, the circumstances, events, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a long story. That's another talk.
In a condensed version, I guess.
I do have some books in the back. My book, Godless, tells the story. And Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword to my book, Godless. And I think this is a compliment. He said, Dan Barker is the most eloquent witness of internal delusion that I know. He said Dan was not just a preacher. He was the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. And that was me. And I was a true believer. I really thought the world was ending. I loved Jesus and the Bible, and I felt the Holy Spirit, and I got goosebumps, and it was all. I thought the goosebumps were evidence of the Holy Spirit. I didn't realize goosebumps are actually evidence for evolution. Did you know that? Because why do we get goosebumps? What good are goosebumps? What good are they? Because our hairier ancestors used them for thermal control. You know, when it was cold, you would raise the fur, or just get larger to scare off a predator. So when do you get goosebumps? When you're cold or when you're scared, usually. But I thought I was feeling the Holy Spirit, and I thought Jesus was coming any minute, and I spent 19 years preaching, and eventually changed my mind through reading, a gradual process. Didn't happen overnight. It was just a gradual. I know a lot of people like this. In fact, there's a brand new group started that you can't join. It's called the Clergy Project. There's a group now that Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, Linda Lascola, and I, and a couple of others have started this Clergy Project, which is to help ministers and priests and other clergy who have lost their supernatural beliefs or abandoned them. Some of them would say, I didn't lose it, I gave it up. But they're still preaching. Right now, there's 32 people in the group that are getting up on Sunday morning and preaching, and they're atheists, but they're stuck. They have, health care and an income and children to support, and they want to get out. And some of them, 3 of them have left this year, actually, since we started in March. So I was one of those guys. I was in the ministry, and I was gradually changing my views, becoming less fundamentalist, more moderate, more liberal, which happens a lot the more you learn. Until finally I dumped out all the bathwater, and I said, hey, there's no baby there. There's no evidence for a God. There's no coherent definition of a God. There's no agreement among believers about the nature or the moral principles of this God. There's no good arguments for a God, and Bertrand Russell and others have debated these arguments over and over. And Bertrand Russell basically said they're all just bad grammar is all they are. They all boil down. And there's no need for a God because millions of good people live happy, moral, meaningful lives. And I basically swung clear to that end and realized I don't believe anymore. And it wasn't because some atheist convinced me. I didn't even like the word atheist. It was just me in my own mind. And these other clergy that I know, there's 122 of us in the group now, and every week there's 3 or 4 more that are joining. Most of us are former clergy, and we're helping. It's like a safe house for existing clergy. I know ministers. I know a minister in Eastern Tennessee. I know one in North Carolina. They're evangelical conservative churches. They're preaching, but their sermons are more like morality. Now, they're not so much hell and heaven stuff anymore. And they don't want to be in the pulpit anymore. It's a horrible thing to... What other profession is there? Dawkins writes about it in the Welcome to this project. What other profession, if you change your views, your whole self, your whole standing, your whole community, your whole who you are, everything changes. And they lose family members, they lose friends. They, I lost a lot of friends, but Jerry DeWitt is a Louisiana Pentecostal preacher who this summer just announced that he's no longer a believer. He's an atheist. He left, I think it was in July or August, he left the ministry. His income is cut in half. And he says, I couldn't be happier. What's the price of integrity, And he's really on fire now. He's he's working with these atheist groups, and I gotta push humanism, and he's one of these really fun guys. And he knows the Bible inside out and backwards, and he's one of our screeners, because when people try to join the group, we have to make sure they're really legit. They're not trying to infiltrate for some reason. So anyway, that's my story in a really brief nutshell. And I can't give you much of the reasons. It's all in the book, but the reliability of the Bible, morality, things like that were big parts of my change.
Any more questions?
Oh, Jeff. Oh, there's Mr. Comic Book Man. Give a plug to your store.
Okay, jhcomics.com. Thank you. Hey, in the lacrosse case, I think it was the Knights of Columbus who they took the parkland and made it private so that they were able to continue with having a cross there. And that kind of is the general trend of the urge to privatize everything, like with the unprecedented rise of private military contractors and you know, how is there it seems like this kind of rise, this moral majority, that there's a confluence of like political, religious forces that are pushing towards more privatization of everything, and as a result putting any sort of constitutional protections out of bounds for many people.
Yeah.
So I don't know my question.
That happens a lot. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, in Cameron Park, there's 10 Commandments monument sitting on public property, not private property, right in the park. And we sued twice. We sued once in the 80s, and then we sued again in the early, about 10 years ago. And basically what happened was the city donated a little piece of that land around the 10 Commandments back to the Knights of Columbus that had given it to them, and said, see, now it's not city land anymore, which means we won. The city no longer owns it, the city no longer maintains it, but it's still sitting in the same spot. And if you go to that park right now, there's not one iron gate thing around it, there's two. The Knights of Columbus have their own, and there's a disclaimer there. So you're walking through the city park, and suddenly there's this little square, really weird, of private property in the middle of the public park, right? That's how they got around. It happened in Marshfield. Up in Marshfield, we sued over that big Jesus on the statue up there. And they did the same thing. They said, well, we'll give a little piece of the city park. So in one sense, we won the case because now the city is now no longer promoting religion. But it was a trick. It was a ruse. It was a sham. It was a way for the city to say, well, we still want to maintain the values of the religious people. So we can call it a victory, but what kind of a victory is that? Well, the victory is that now there's this ugly fence around it. And that should make it clear that that's private property now. So.
Actually, I was going to bring that. That's where I'm from, and it's a huge, horrible white sign on it that says, you know, this is private property.
Yeah.
It's really rather not drive by it.
Yeah, it's weird. It's just totally, you know, a monstrosity, really. Why didn't they move it across the street? That's where the Knights of Columbus had their headquarters. Just why didn't they put it there, put lights on it and display it, you know? I mean, why does it have to be there? You know, maybe this isn't the best image, but it reminds me of these territorial animals that have to go around marking off their boundaries, you know? This is we need to have our religion here, and in the state capitol, and in the public schools, and there's just something about wanting to establish, you wanting some kind of governmental endorsement for your belief. And that's kind of what was going on there in La Crosse.
Well, it looks like we're running out of time, but let's get a round of applause for Dan Barker.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm an unannounced participant. My name is Charles Cohen. I'm professor of history and religious studies at the university and director of the Lubar Institute for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions. In that capacity, I'm also the lead faculty member for the UW-Madison's year-long response to the White House Campus Interfaith and Service and Community Challenge. The challenge, which is the brainchild of Ibu Patel, the Interfaith Youth Corps of Chicago, and also a member of the President's Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Relationships, is engaged more than 200 campuses across the country to develop various programs that encourage interfaith discussion and interfaith service activities. This event tonight is part of UW's year-long participation in that initiative. And I'd like to suggest, if you're interested in this, we have a website that's on the Lubar Institute's homepage. That's the link to it. And you can find events. If you're interested in involving yourself in, say, Twitter discussions or Facebook discussions, you can get online there as well. Now, some of you may or perhaps may not think it's kind of incongruous. Why would an event sponsored by atheists, humanists, and agnostics of UW-Madison be included in the interfaith initiative. To my mind, there's absolutely no incongruity.
7.5% to 8% of Americans who picked no religion, whatever that means. 11 years later, the same survey with Barry Cosman and others, that went up to 14.5%. And since that time, it's gone up to almost 16%. So whatever it means, non-religion is growing. We do know that this generation right now, young people, college age to 20-somethings, is the least religious ever. It's up to almost 30% of this demographic that is non-religious. And there's talk about the 30% under 30. You young people probably don't know how good it is right now compared to what it used to be in the past. And groups like this, like AHA, there's groups all over the country. The Secular Student Alliance has more than 300 groups right now, when a few years ago they only had 40. They're just popping up all over. In Australia, there's now a national group of free thought college group, campus groups, and they met last year for the first time, and a lot of them thought they were the only ones. They started this group on campus because what are we going to do? There's all these religious groups, and what about us non-religious? And so when they got together, they found out there were 25 others, and they were all surprised to see it happen. That's kind of neat. That's showing that there's a movement that's from the bottom up. It's an organic thing. It's not like some atheist evangelist came to your campus and said, we're going to convert all of you to atheism, and you need, it wasn't that. It's just human beings naturally, organically. Whatever it was that happened in Europe, and there are a lot of explanations for it, after centuries of devout religious belief and religious fighting and wars and the 30 Years' Wars, which wasn't just, like Christians versus the Muslims. It was.
So welcome the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Charles. You had to remind me about Dinesh D'Souza. That was a fun debate. He's quite a character, but I don't think there was anyone in that audience that he did not offend in some way or other. Even the Catholic people who invited him, I asked him, did he think transubstantiation was real? And he said, no, that's just a metaphor. I said, well, then were Adam and Eve real? And he said, no, that's just a metaphor. And he said, those Bible-believing born-agains are ignoramuses, he said. And I said, well, if that's just a metaphor, is God a metaphor? And were you there? He said, yeah, God's a metaphor too. So what is he arguing for, actually? And then he said, there is no such thing as there are no atheists. He said, there are only wounded theists. That's what he called us, non-believers. So we did 7 debates total since then. And it's always fun to educate and to rile up. I love audiences that are hostile and riled up. It gets me going. So please don't be too polite tonight. I'm in better form when you're not. And it's true, right now, whatever it means to be non-religious, and a lot of non-religious people are indeed spiritual in some way. Non-religious people can have beliefs, they're just not religious. Whatever that means, that is the fastest growing, quote-unquote, religion in the United States right now. In 1990, the American Religious Identification Survey reported 70
at all. The initiative is designed to bring together people from different faith traditions, and to my mind that includes no faith traditions at all. It's precisely those people who should not be left out. Statistics, polls have suggested at least 2 things about the group we'll call basically atheists, agnostics, and humanists. One is that they continue to be distrusted by perhaps as large a percentage of Americans as distrust any particular religious group. And the second thing is that the same polls often show that this group is one of the largest, or perhaps the most quickly rising number of Americans as well. We can dispute what no religion when people put this down might mean, but I think the statistics suggest that the group of people who are distancing themselves at the very least from received traditions is growing. To my mind, as someone very interested in American religious pluralism, as I teach it in my classes, and as someone who is also very interested in having people of different backgrounds talk to each other, because it is precisely those kinds of conversations, I think, that, as I like to say, thicken American civil society and increase the conversations among individuals of different backgrounds, and one hopes provide greater understanding of different traditions among people of other traditions. That this group is precisely one that needs to be included. And so Chris Calvi, who's been very deeply involved, there's Chris, in AHA, when we put out the word last spring that this initiative was gearing up, he replied, and as he can tell you on more than one occasion, I've urged him to get this symposium or this event started. So again, I'm delighted to give you a little bit of background on the initiative and this particular event. And now I'll introduce Mike Renuta, who is president of the AHA, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Amita. I'm the president of the AHA. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is awesome that we got such a good showing. Just a plug for another event we're doing next week. We're going to be having a debate with Badger Catholic at the, which one is that? No, not Union South, the Union Theater. And it's going to be awesome. It's going to be a panel discussion of some of our students against some Badger Catholic students, so we're really excited about that. I'd like to thank again the White House Initiative Challenge. It's really exciting. We raised, last I heard was like $1,600 in an interfaith way to raise money for Second Harvest Food Bank, so that's a great thing. We're doing very well with that. And I'd also like to thank the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as well as the Madison Area Coalition of Reason. And without any more words, I'd like to bring up our speaker tonight. He was a preacher for almost 20 years, but now he doesn't do that anymore. He preaches for our side. He's the author of The Good Atheist, and you may have known him from his big debate with Dinesh D'Souza last year. That was a lot of fun.